I want to give a shout out to MCAT, Missoula Community Access Television. They sponsored the event. They're providing the film recording, the video recording of the event. It'll be available on their website and on their Facebook page. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Also want to start by thanking our distinguished panel. When I say distinguished, I really mean it. These are some of the biggest experts in wildlife management, wildlife biology. We have a diverse group. We have representation from the tribes. We have an attorney. I'm trying to get away from the speakers. I'm hearing the feedback. But I just want to start out by reading their bios. So I'll start out with Gary Wolf. Oh, and I see we have Mike Bader coming down the hall. Gary Wolf holds a PhD in wildlife biology and has more than 45 years of conservation and natural resource management experience in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. His career has included 5 seasons as a ranger with the National Park Service, 12 years as a fishery and wildlife biologist, hunting and fishing guide, and wrangler on a large ranch in northern New Mexico. 15 years with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation in various positions, including Director of Field Operations, Chief Operating Officer, and CEO. 11 years as Executive Director of Vital Ground, a wildlife-focused land trust working to ensure the recovery and long-term survival of grizzly bears through the protection and restoration of core habitats and landscape linkages. 6 years as Executive Director of the Cinnabar Foundation, a private grant-making foundation supporting conservation organizations in Montana and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. In addition to his day jobs, Gary was appointed to the Montana Fish and Wildlife Commission by Governor Steve Bullock in June 2013 and served in that capacity until his term expired in April 2017. Gary retired in June 2021, but remains active in Montana conservation issues and serves on several NGO boards. Chris Servine. Christopher Servine is a distinguished bear biologist who holds a BA, BS in zoology, wildlife biology from the University of Montana, an MS in wildlife biology from the University of Washington, and a PhD in forestry and wildlife biology from the University of Montana. He was a grizzly bear recovery coordinator for the U.S. Fish Wildlife Services for 35 years and led the EIS team for the Bitterroot Grizzly Bear Reintroduction EIS and was responsible for the final rules recovering and delisting the Yellowstone grizzly population in 2007 and in 2016. He managed the now historic Wyoming, Idaho, and Washington, the now historic recovery grizzly bears in the lower 48 states, and led the grizzly bear recovery program in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Washington, and worked closely with grizzly bear biologists in Alberta and British Columbia. Chris is also an adjunct professor at the University of Montana and has led efforts for grizzly reintroduction in the Bitterroot Mountains, and he's also the former co-chair of the IUCN's Bear Specialist Group. He's worked in many countries in Asia and in Europe on bears and bear conservation, including Japan, Malaysia, China, Taiwan, Laos, Greece, Austria, France, and Spain, and was a Fulbright scholar in Greece. He was also the co-chair when I already covered the IUCN. Chris Latre. Chris is a Métis storyteller and Montana poet laureate, descendant of the Pembina Band of the mighty Red River of the North, and an enrolled member of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians. His third book, Becoming Little Shell, Returning Home to the Landless Indians of Montana, will be published by Milkweed Editions on August 20th, 2024. His first book, One Sentence Journal, Short Poems and Essays from the World at Large, won the 2018 Montana Book Award and a 2019 High Plains Book Award. His book of haiku and haibun poetry, Descended from a Travel-Worn Satchel, was published in 2021 by Foothills Publishing. Chris writes the weekly newsletter, An Irritable Métis, and lives near Frenchtown, Montana. He is the Montana Poet Laureate for 2023-2025. If you guys want to raise your hands when I introduce you, that'd be great. You don't have to. Lizzie Pennick is a driving force for positive change. Started as a carnivore coexistence attorney with Wild Earth Guardians based in Missoula. She earned a BS in marine science from the University of Hawaii and a JD from Lewis and Clark Law School, where she focused on environmental law and federal Indian law as it applies to the environment and natural resources. Upon graduating law school, she was awarded a certificate in environmental, natural resources, and energy law. The 2021 the Cornelius Honor Society by faculty and staff. Prior to joining Guardians, she worked with Cragg Law Center and the Center for Biological Diversity, where she focused on salmon protection. She has been recognized for her leadership in environmental law and earned accolades and awards showcasing her dedication to wildlife conservation. Mike Bader. Mike Vader reflects a hands-on understanding of wildlife as a seasoned independent natural resource consultant from Missoula with over 35 years of expertise in landscape conservation, natural resource management, research, and policy. He has served in the roles of National Park Ranger and Executive Director with extensive experience in bear management, notably with the Yellowstone Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team. Mike is committed to integrating non-agency affiliated scientific perspectives. He is the author of numerous peer-reviewed papers, and his significant role in advancing and his impactful contributions have been recognized by professional societies, underscoring his significant role in advancing environmental knowledge. He has published several peer-reviewed papers and reports, presented at major conferences, and given innumerable interviews in national and international media. David Stalling. David Stalling is a combat Marine veteran. He's a Missoulian with a background as a hunter, angler, writer, activist, and former Force Recon Marine. Dave holds degrees in both wildlife and journalism from the University of Montana. Throughout his career, he has dedicated himself to wildlife conservation and wildlife management reform in various nonprofit capacities, advocating for the protection of wildlife and preserving natural habitats. Residing in Missoula, Montana, Stalling loves exploring the wilderness during his free time. Rocky Sainert. Rocky Sainert has a master's degree in rural, town, and regional planning and worked as a public planner in Missoula and Hamilton. Rocky attended 6 colleges and universities, including the University of Houston, University of Montana, and Texas Tech University twice. His areas of study included wildlife policy, alternative dispute resolution, environmental law, and land use planning, management, and design with an emphasis on environmental and natural resources planning. Rocky's research formed the basis for the Our Children's Trust lawsuit against the U.S. government for failing to protect the atmosphere as a public trust. While OTC was unsuccessful on procedural grounds, the recent Held v. Montana case, built on similar arguments, has compelled the Montana government to consider climate change and environmental decision-making. Formalizing a comprehensive public trust in the environment remains Rocky's quest. I'm going to start with each one of the panelists providing their own individual presentations. For those of you who didn't hear, if you came in late, after they present, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. We'll start off with Gary Wolf.
Well, thank you, Jessica. Is this microphone working okay for folks to hear me? Well, we're going to kick off tonight's panel with a discussion, kind of an overview of state fish and wildlife commissions. And the reason we're going to do this is because so many of the decisions affecting Montana's wildlife ultimately come through the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Commission. Not all the decisions, but an awful lot of them do. And I spent a lot of my career as a professional biologist interacting with various state agencies and wildlife commissions, and I really thought that I knew how they worked. I thought I really understood it. And then Governor Bullock appointed me to the Montana Commission back in 2013. And that was when my education about commissions really started. I realized I didn't know near as much as I thought I did about commissions. And I also recognized that there was a lot of public misconceptions about what commissions do, what their authority is, and what their role is. So I'd like to start with just a real general overview of fish and wildlife commissions, and then follow up with some examples of some of my experiences when I served on the Montana Commission. And my challenge is going to be to try and consolidate what little I've learned over 40 years about wildlife commissions into a 12-minute presentation. So I may be talking fast for a while. So first of all, what's the purpose of a Fish and Wildlife Commission? Well, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies is a national overview or national umbrella organization that represents all of the state fish and wildlife departments throughout the country. And their purpose is to advance sound science-based management and conservation of fish and wildlife in the public interest. And one of the things they did a number of years ago was to prepare a handbook called the Commission Guidebook. And really what this is a best practices handbook for how state fish and wildlife commissions should operate. And I received this when I went through my Montana Commission orientation during my first month on the commission. It's got lots of great information in it, and I'm going to extract just a couple of things really quick from this book about the history of fish and wildlife commissions. And the first ones really came about in the early part of the 20th century for a number of different purposes, but two of which are really what I'm going to focus on tonight. One is to avoid the undue intrusion of politics into agency management. Should be laughing about that one. And second, to ensure citizen participation in establishing agency policy. There's a number of other things that commissions do, but those were two of the primary reasons commissions were established. And the commission model that's laid out here really suggests that commission members should be appointed by the governor, and they should be confirmed by the state senate. And they also suggest that commissioners should serve staggered terms so that anytime there's a change in the administration, there's not a 100% change in the commission, that there's always carryover from one commission or to the next when the governors change. And it really is designed that way to try and provide some stability for the agency and some institutional memory from one commission to another. Another thing to remember is that each Fish and Wildlife Commission is unique. Each state commission operates under the authority granted by their own individual state legislatures. So how Montana operates is different than how Idaho operates, is different than how North Carolina operates. There's similarities but differences. So for some Montana specifics, Montana has a 7-member wildlife commission. There's one commissioner for each one of FWP's 7 administrative regions. You know, Missoula is one of the regions, Region 2. Up in Kalispell, that's Region 1. So there's 7 different commissioners. They have to geographically live within the district that they represent. The commissioners are appointed by the governor, as the model suggests, and once the governor appoints them, we have to go before the Senate Fish and Game Committee for Senate confirmation. It's a confirmation hearing just like they have in the United States Senate. And if the committee decides they want to recommend that commissioner for approval, they vote on it, and then that goes to the full Senate for ultimate approval by the full Senate. The commissioners serve 4-year terms, and again, there is a staggered model. 4 commissioners are tied to the governor's 4-year term. 3 of the commissioners are offset by 2 years. So theoretically, there's always going to be a carryover. Theoretically, that didn't always happen. So going back to one of the primary purposes, avoid the undue intrusion of politics into the agency management. Now, I'm going to give a couple of examples of what happened when I was on the commission, simply related to the appointment of the commissioners. The Senate confirmation used to be almost automatic. The governor would make his recommendation, the Senate would approve them. But it has now become a very political and a very controversial process. I mean, it is just unbelievable what happens when the governor appoints a new commissioner, especially if the legislature is dominated by a different party than what the governor is. An example, Dr. Bob Ream. I'm sure many of you remember Dr. Bob Ream, highly respected professor at the University of Montana, wildlife professor, served in the state legislature for 16 years. He also was a Fish and Wildlife Commissioner under Governor Schweitzer. When Governor Bullock was elected, he wanted to reappoint Bob Ream to the commission. But after 16 years in the legislature, Bob had made a few enemies on the other side of the aisle. And that particular party came to him, several key senators, and said, Bob, you're not going to have the votes to be confirmed. It just isn't going to happen. No matter what Governor Bullock says, you will not be confirmed. So Bob Ream is a very gracious individual, and he voluntarily pulled back and told Governor Bullock, hey, don't waste a lot of time and energy because I won't be confirmed. That was when I got appointed. Governor Bullock did his own political maneuvering and waited until after the legislature adjourned, and then he appointed me as an interim commissioner. So I served on the commission for 2 years before I ever had a Senate confirmation hearing. So that was some pretty interesting political interference there. And then when I left the commission, after my 4-year term expired, the individual that Governor Bullock had appointed to replace me went before the Senate Fish and Game Committee for his confirmation hearing. They didn't particularly like some of the things he had written in the past in the newspaper, so they did not recommend him for confirmation. So he never even got a vote on the Senate floor. And then late in Governor Bullock's term, one of the commissioners had to resign because he moved out of the district. And so Governor Bullock had to appoint a replacement commissioner. But by that time, it was clear that there was only a few months left in his term. The Republican Fish and Game Committee basically said, we're not going to even have a hearing on this person. We're going to wait until we have a new governor and let the new governor appoint a commissioner. And that was very, very similar to what Mitch McConnell did when President Obama nominated Merrick Garland for the Supreme Court and never got a hearing. So the same kind of politics were going on with Fish and Wildlife commissioners. So powers of the commission, and again, they vary from state to state depending upon the legislature. For example, in Montana, the governor appoints the director of the department. The commission has no role in appointing and selecting the director. In some states, the commission actually conducts the director interviews and makes a recommendation to the governor, maybe recommends 2 or 3 individuals, and the governor appoints from that. In other states, the commission actually interviews and hires the director, and the director works for the commission, does not work for the governor. So it's different. In a situation like that, the commission would have a lot more influence over day-to-day operations of the department than what we have in Montana, where the director reports to the governor and not to the commission. So there's some differences from state to state. And the commission authority is granted by the state legislature. What the commission can do is laid out in statute. And this was a book that I was given, again, in my first probably month with the commission. It's Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks statutes. These are all Montana statutes that relate to fish and wildlife laws, what the commission, what the department can do. There's a lot of them in here. I had no idea till I went on the commission that it was basically codified like this. Good things and bad things about that. For example, one of the things that we wanted to do when I was on the commission was to address this question of M44 devices. You're probably familiar with those. Those are the cyanide guns, coyote getters that are used. Several of us on the commission said, wait a minute, we really need to do something about all of these cyanide guns scattered all over our public lands. We'd like to regulate those in some manner. We had absolutely no authority to do that. The department didn't have the authority. The commission did not have the authority because the department does not have the statutory authority to manage coyotes. So there was something that, you'd think, hey, the commission should do something about this. We had no statutory authority to do that. So just a good example of what all of these statutes can do in terms of giving you authority or limiting your authority on the Fish and Wildlife Commission. And the legislature's involvement in wildlife regulations. And something I wanted to touch on here. This is done by statute. It's pointed out right here. And those statutes can be very general. It could be something as broad as a statute that says the Montana Fish and Wildlife Commission has the power to establish season dates and bag limits for hunting elk. I mean, that's really good. That provides maximum flexibility for the professionals within the department and the commission to deal with changing wildlife population dynamics, changing habitat conditions, adapt quickly as necessary because they have the power to do so. We're getting close? Okay. I've got 15 more minutes to go. So quickly, though, basically, where was I here? There can be very prescriptive legislation. They could come in and say the commission can only have a season between December 1st and December 15th, and all you can do is shoot 4-point bull elk. Very prescriptive. You know, no flexibility at all for the biologists. And the legislature by statute can actually force the commission to develop regulations that they really don't want to. A good example of that is wolf snaring. Up until 2021, although the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks had the authority to authorize wolf snaring during the wolf trapping season, they decided not to do that. They didn't think that was the way to go. But in the 2021 legislative session, a bill was passed that required that wolf snaring be authorized in areas where wolf trapping was allowed. That was basically the legislature forcing their will upon Fish, Wildlife, and Parks through prescriptive legislation. So with that, I'm going to just end real quick and run 30 seconds over and say, what can you do about it? You have to engage with the Fish and Wildlife Commission. You have to engage with the legislature. Find out who your commissioner is. Get to know them. Not just showing up at the commission meeting, but get to know them. Be respectful, even if you disagree with their position. Find out who your state legislature is, and most importantly, find out who's on the two very significant legislative committees, the House Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Committee and the Senate Fish and Game Committee, because they're driving so much that's going on in Montana right now. So thank you very much. Sorry I ran over a minute. And now the folks that are going to talk about wildlife can jump into the good stuff now. We've got the policy stuff out of the way.
No problem. Thank you, Gary. Next, we're going to go with Chris Latreille, Poet Laureate of the state of Montana.
Bonjour. Indinoe Maganadog. Chris Ka Shinikashin. What I said there is hello, all of my relatives in Anishinaabemoan, followed by, you may call me Chris, in Michif, which is the language, the two languages of my people. So the Little Shell official language is Anishinaabemoan, Ojibwe. We're largely comprised of Métis people, and our language is Michif. And it's interesting to be in an anti-trapping environment when our entire existence begins as trappers. But I am no longer in support of the barbaric practice, just to make that very clear. The next thing I would like to make very clear is I'm not here as a representative of any tribes. I am a representative of myself. I'm an enrolled Little Shell member. Sometimes they ask me to speak for the tribe, but this is not one of those cases. Nor would I be so arrogant as to think that I speak for my Salish relatives, or my Kootenai relatives, or my Blackfeet relatives, or the rest of my Pembina Chippewa relatives of whom I am descended from, or my Nez Perce relatives, or my Crow relatives, or anybody who used this particular, who interacted with this particular piece of land, or any of the land that we talk about when we talk about Montana, or even erasing kind of the whole idea of borders in a way that we do with state boundaries and national boundaries and all of those things that we did not recognize the existence of. We live as indigenous people holding multiple truths at one time, just like as anybody else does. And certainly our stake in the protection and preservation of our wildlife relatives exists in those two worlds too, because we are trying to interact with organizations who represent the occupying power that holds us in a certain position of lesser than. So that is a reality. Whatever we talk about with state, federal, local governments are occupying powers, powering over our own view of how we lived on the world for thousands of years. And when I listen to all these, you know, laws and systems and processes and procedures, and I think, man, we really mess things up in a very short amount of time. when you think of just the bureaucracy involved and the politics that can ruin people's efforts to do the right thing. And it's important to recognize that this is not an anomaly. So like what we're seeing with public land, threats to public land, threats to wildlife, it's not an anomaly. This is how the United States works. This is how the machine was designed. This is not an undocumented feature. This is how it has been from the beginning. And part of making the changes that we need to make in order to preserve these magnificent relatives that we are all here on behalf of is to recognize that all of these relationships are linked. And we can't Band-Aid things around in bits and pieces and expect it to survive moving forward. And there's the world that is, and that's the one that we were trying to change. And sometimes the Band-Aids is really the best first step we can make. But we have to recognize that the very foundation of the system that we're operating in is what needs to change. And however we do that, there are smarter people who can answer that than I can. You know, I have a high school diploma. I don't have a degree. I don't have a PhD. The only thing I've been appointed to is poet laureate by probably the worst governor in the history of governors, who probably doesn't read poetry and thinks poetry is something that should be logged out of existence. So take that with whatever I have to say. But we're talking about wolves. We're talking about grizzly bears. We're talking, I want to add bison to the conversation as well. 3 animals that to us, besides being relatives, are powerful enough in our spiritual world, in our cultural world, to represent 3, speaking from as an Anishinaabe person, and our 7 grandfather teachings, which is kind of our blueprint for how you should live your life. Each of those 7 teachings is represented by an animal. And those 3 animals are 3 of our grandfathers. So the wolf, Maingan, represents humility. Bison, Bijiki, represents respect. And the bear, Magua, represents strength. And when I think about how we are living with those animals now versus how we live with them for generation upon generation upon generation, where is our humility as relatives with all of these other people that we share the world with? Where did we suddenly leave our humility behind in recognizing or assuming that we are this higher power, that we are the highest level of species on the planet? Our failure to be humble in our relationship with the rest of the world is largely why we find ourselves in the position we're in, with massive extinction, irrational rhetoric as it relates to how we live with these animals, humility. We've distanced ourselves from it. How about respect when it comes to Bijiki? You know, we see the buffalo as the symbol of respect because he recognizes how important he is to the rest of the world. So there's a lot of talk about, well, to move forward, we need to re-indigenize things, whether it's how we deal with wildfire, how we deal with plains restoration. But you know, we weren't the apex in the Great Plains from almost the entire continent. It was the buffalo that everybody followed, from bugs to plants, to birds who ate those bugs, to birds who ate, you know, bigger birds who ate those birds, and all the animals. We were just another in that web of animals who benefited from the buffalo and what they gave to the rest of us. And that is why we see Bijiki, Mashkade Bijiki, the plains buffalo, which literally means fuck around and find out, as one of my relatives quipped one time. Get it? The buffalo is the respect. He recognizes what he means to the rest of the world, and he is willing to give of himself so that the rest of us can survive. And then Magua. the grizzly bear or the black bear. We don't have a distinction in our spiritual world between the two and what they represent. Strength. You know, what's more fierce than a mama bear? You know, there's, sadly, every time I go up in the Flathead, I see a bumper sticker on the back of a minivan or something that says Mama Bear on board with like a AK-47 next to it or something like that. So we've kind of drifted away from the ferocity of what Mama Bear means, but that strength that bears bring is something that is so important to how we view the world and how we live in the world, how we are going to protect each other. And too often we distance ourselves from the spiritual and cultural relationships that we have with these animals, and we descend into number crunching and all of these things, and we don't look at some of the kind of key realities that we can't fix anything without addressing, whether it's the humility and the respect and the strength and courage that comes from all of that, but also, you know, how do we reconnect Yellowstone to the Yukon, for example, while still living this idea? There's a better anecdote for this. Does anybody ever see the movie Hostiles with Christian Bale? It's a Western. He's escorting this former enemy of his, a Cheyenne chief, and he's bringing him, I think, from Texas or New Mexico or something. He has to escort him to die where he's from, which is Montana. And they get to his final burial place, and he, spoiler alert, he dies. You knew it was coming. And they're preparing his cairn, and these horsemen approach. And this guy comes up and he basically tells these folks to get off. This is my land. Get off my land. And the person I was with leans over and says, well, you can certainly tell they're in Montana now, can't you? Just the idea, the public, the private ownership is one of those things that unless we figure out a way to deal with, we are not going to be able to make the long game changes that we need to make to restore these ecosystems back to any semblance of what they used to be. And around here, that's, you know, politicians certainly aren't going to talk about it. But the idea that people have that they can do anything they want with their land, regardless of who's on it or how that ties to the larger picture. Everything we're dealing about with animals and wildlife and plants has everything to do with our houseless people. It has everything to do with people being forced out of their homes because the jobs they have do not meet the requirements to live where they've lived forever. All of these things are related, and we're all working in our own little arenas to address those problems. But I hope that as we move forward, we can see those connections. That is re-indigenizing. You know, my Salish relatives down in the Bitterroot, they didn't have some people living with 3 teepees and families without. In my culture, if somebody brought home a moose, everybody ate. They didn't hoard it for themselves. We have lost that relationship. Man, that was the quickest 12 minutes. I got 1 minute. I will leave it to my next relative. Miigwech, Chi Miigwech, for having me here.
Wow. Thank you. Chris McCrae, everyone. Next, I think we're going to have Lizzie Pennick, and I'm going to stand over here. Every time I get close to the speaker, get close to this powerful panel, my mic gets static.
It's us.
It's you.
Yeah. Hello, can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay. Hi, I'm Lizzie. I am here to provide a legal perspective, I think, although as our first panelist talked about, it's hard to avoid the law and wildlife these days. And I want to touch on something Chris said to begin, which is how have we failed so poorly? Well, we failed fantastically, actually, at preserving some of our species such that we need these laws and these bureaucratic systems and these complicated webs and a book of statutes this thick to tell wildlife commissioners what they can and can't do. That's a question I don't have an answer for, but it is my job to work within the law to try to preserve what we have left. And so I'm going to talk to you about the federal law, which is the Endangered Species Act. It interacts in Montana law and politics, for example, with the grizzly bear, which is what I'm going to use as I go through this for examples. So we're going to talk about the ESA. We're going to look at how grizzly bear conservation has been impacted by the ESA. And then we're going to talk about the fate of grizzly bears regarding what happens with the ESA and their protections under it. So this is going to be hard to believe if you don't already know this, but the Endangered Species Act was signed into law by a Republican president in 1973. It passed unanimously in the Senate, and in the House, it passed by a vote of 355-4, which is almost impossible to imagine that happening for a basic piece of legislation these days, let alone something like the Endangered Species Act. And it's not just the law that is so strong, but it's the way courts have interpreted it over the last 50 years that has really given a lot of power to it when we use it in lawsuits. So the purposes of the Endangered Species Act are to prevent extinction. As Chris was talking about, you know, we've seen a lot of these species that people lived alongside for thousands and thousands of years disappear, many into extinction, some into near extinction just in the 1800s and 1900s as colonial settlers moved across the West. So the ESA was necessary to prevent extinction of our wildlife. And the point of listing a species is to recover it to the point where it doesn't need the protection of that law anymore. And ecosystems are part of that too. So protecting the ecosystems upon which these species depend. I'm going to talk about three distinct parts of the Endangered Species Act and why we can use it, and then how we can use it. So when you think about enforcing the law, you might think about law enforcement agencies. There are whole entities in state and federal governments and tribal governments whose job it is to enforce laws. But I could enforce the Endangered Species Act. You could enforce the Endangered Species Act. And that's because it has a citizen suit provision. So written into the law, any person can commence a civil suit to put a stop to any violations of the act. So if you think someone or some entity is violating the law, you have the power to do something about it. So that means nonprofits, like where I work at Wild Earth Guardians, we use this law all the time. And some of the things we do under that law include enforcing the take prohibition. So this is Section 9 of the law. And basically it says that once a species is listed, you can no longer take that species. And take is very broad. Harass, hunt, shoot, capture, trap, kill, collect, wound, harm, pursue, or attempt any of these activities is illegal, generally. So that applies to anyone violating the law. Government entities, private companies. One example of using this take prohibition is in a lawsuit that Wild Earth Guardians is a part of against BNSF Railways. So this is I'm sure you've all seen the railway cars coming through town. They operate hundreds of miles of tracks through prime grizzly bear habitat up near Flathead Lake and along the border of Glacier National Park. And they've killed over 60 grizzly bears in the past several decades. And they know it's going to happen. They've been told it's going to keep happening, and they just keep doing it. So that's an example of where we can say, hey, you know, we're going to take you to court. Another example, the last example I'll give you, is called federal agency consultation. So this is not something that citizens do necessarily, but when, let's take the Custer Gallatin National Forest. We know there are grizzly bears there. It's recognized by the federal government that there are grizzly bears there. So if another federal agency wants to do some sort of action there, like log or mine or something like that, they have to do what's called consultation. So they would talk to Fish and Wildlife Service, which is the agency responsible for managing listed species, and they would have to go through these procedures and analyses to make sure whatever action that wasn't going to jeopardize the continued existence of the one or more listed species in that area. So, for example, Wild Earth Guardians is part of a lawsuit against the U.S. Forest Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service because they authorized a clear cut right near Yellowstone National Park that would have cut down 6 square miles of forest and build a bunch of roads in prime grizzly bear habitat, prime connectivity habitat to get grizzly bears out of the Yellowstone ecosystem. So when you sue under Section 7, you would say, hey, federal agencies, you're supposed to follow these steps. You're supposed to use the best available science. You're supposed to analyze everything that could be relevant. Often they don't. That is why I have a job. And that's when we can step in and point those things out and hopefully win in court and put a stop to those projects and at least force them to do their job, which shouldn't be my job to force somebody else to do their job. But that is unfortunately how the system works. So why can we use the ESA for grizzly bears? That is because they are listed. So talking before about how our wildlife, grizzly bears used to roam from Canada to Mexico. There were about 50,000 bears across 18 western states. And then in the 1800s and the 1900s, due to excessive human-caused mortality, they got down to less than 1,000 animals by the time they got listed in 1975 in just a few areas. And Montana is lucky to have some of those areas. So that is why we can use the ESA to protect them. And since 1975, because that take prohibition has been in place, because there are more procedures to do things that might destroy their habitat or other similar things, they have rebounded to about 2,000 bears now today, which is still a fraction of what they should be, what they could be. But because of politics and because predators in particular are so politicized, especially in Montana, especially by this government and this legislature that we've had for the past 2 sessions, Montana is pushing to remove Endangered Species Act protections from the grizzly bear. So you could have seen billboards. There's a lot of propaganda going around that says conservation success story. Grizzly bears are recovered. Well, it's not true. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. We're still looking at a few core areas where there are a lot of grizzly bears, like the Greater Yellowstone area and around Glacier National Park, which is the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. And so Montana and Wyoming are both using the Endangered Species Act to say, hey, Fish and Wildlife Service, look at these 2 areas. Grizzly bears are doing great. Just draw a circle on the map and remove protections from those bears. That happened at the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022. And in February 2023, Fish and Wildlife Service responded and said, yeah, that could be right. It might be time to do that. So they are currently in the process of figuring out what's called a 12-month status review. So they are looking at whether it is warranted to delist, so remove Endangered Species Act protections from either of those populations. But the point is, why grizzly bears are not recovered is because 2 populations in boundaries, like little wild zoos, is not recovery. We should see a connected metapopulation of grizzly bears in the lower 48. We need to see grizzly bears in the Bitterroot ecosystem. And we need to see genetic exchange from these hot spots where we have a lot of grizzly bears. And that is not what we have right now. So we are looking at this summer probably for a decision by the federal government for whether they will be removing Endangered Species Act protections from one or both of those populations of bears. And I don't know what's going to happen. I know that no matter what, there will be litigation from pro-bear or anti-bear groups that don't like what happened. And then what happens if grizzly bears get delisted, which I think is what a lot of other people are touching on this panel, is they go into state management. And so that's when we see the very politicized Fish and Wildlife Commission appointed by Governor Gianforte coming into play. And the legislature that is now mandating very specific things that wildlife managers are supposed to do in order to kill these animals. We're seeing it with wolves, and I think most people would expect that we would see the same thing with grizzly bears. So I don't know what's going to happen, but if we are learning from the past and what's going on right now with other species, we can have a pretty good idea. But that's why it's so important for everybody in this room to be so active at the state level, because ultimately that's what it's going to come down to, is holding Montana accountable for making sure we don't do to grizzly bears what we're doing to wolves, and that we don't get to the point where we have a few hundred here and a few hundred there and call it good. That's all for me.
Wow, thank you, Lizzie. That was fantastic. I think this is a good segue to go to Chris Servine, and I just want to point out that I'm kind of throwing these guys for a loop. There was a speaking order, and I'm kind of tossing it up based on what other people have said. So, Chris Servine.
Well, good evening, everybody. I assume you can hear me, and this is working. Appreciate you coming out tonight. I hope this is going to be a valuable discussion for you. I look forward to the question and answer here. So, the legislature in Montana has demonstrated a willingness to continue to impose unneeded new predator killing measures in Montana. Since the 2021 legislature, they have passed, and the governor has signed into law laws that impose neck snaring of wolves over bait, which didn't occur before 2021, extending the wolf snaring and trapping season to overlap with the time that grizzlies and black bears are out of their dens, allowing payment to wolf trappers and hunters, which is a bounty, bringing us backward into the 1800s, preventing grizzly bears captured outside recovery zones from being relocated by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks personnel, which is contrary to 40 years of cooperative efforts between Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and other agencies. Allowing hound hunting and hound chasing of black bears, which was banned in Montana for 100 years, since 1921. This was legalized in 2021, and it is being allowed in many places today where grizzlies are present in connectivity areas between grizzly ecosystems. And finally, allowing the shooting of wolves at night over bait using spotlights. Spotlighting wildlife is unethical and contrary to the fair chase principles of hunting, and harms the image of hunters and hunting in Montana. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks administrators and the Fish and Wildlife Commission wrote false information into the current administrative rule governing Fish, Wildlife, and Parks actions that states, and I quote, "Sport hunting is considered the most desirable method of balancing grizzly bear numbers with their available habitat, minimizing depredations against private property within or adjacent to grizzly bear habitat, and minimizing grizzly bear attacks on humans." None of these statements are true. Sport hunting will not balance grizzly bear numbers with their available habitat. Sport hunting will not minimize depredations against private property within or adjacent to grizzly bear habitat. And sport hunting will not minimize grizzly bear attacks on humans. This information was provided to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and the commissioners that this statement was false, and they ignored it. If state politicians are going to ignore facts and science-based wildlife management and prescribe how many predators should be killed and the specific methods used to kill them, it will be difficult to ever manage most carnivore populations sustainably, ever achieve grizzly bear recovery and delisting, and have in place the adequate state regulatory mechanisms necessary for the agencies in the state to credibly manage recovered grizzly bears and wolves. It is important to recognize that the anti-predator policies that I've just described from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and the Commission are not the only threats to wildlife in Montana today. In addition to these legislative and political threats, a second major threat to wildlife in Montana is continued development of private lands in wildlife habitat that is basically unchecked by government agencies. For example, more than 1 million acres of private land that used to be wildlife habitat has been converted to housing development since the year 2000 in Montana. It's 1 million acres gone. 56% of new housing in Montana is built outside incorporated areas like towns that you're looking at right out the window there. That's what's called sprawl, pushing further and further out into wildlife habitat. County growth continues unabated, and that eliminates wildlife habitat and brings more and more people to recreate on adjacent public lands. And we're all surrounded by public lands in Montana. For example, from 2010 to 2023, the population of Gallatin County increased by 42.77%. The Flathead County population increased by 19.2%. Both of those areas are in places where there are grizzly bears. There are now 337,000 more Montana residents than there were when we started grizzly bear recovery in 1981. 337,000 more people live here now. Another big issue is public land recreation continues to increase, and the U.S. Forest Service has demonstrated no willingness or ability to consider the impacts of this increased recreation on wildlife and the experiences of public land users. For example, the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest recently proposed tripling the number of special use permits to more than 33,000 on the Beaverhead Deer Lodge Forest for commercial activities like outfitting, mountain bike tours, snow machine tours, ATV tours, horseback tours, camping guides, hiking guides, fishing guides, etc. These are all people that are bringing people onto public lands and making money from it, and they propose to triple that. There was almost zero consideration in the Forest Service proposal of the impact of this huge increase in commercial activity on public lands on the wildlife that live there or the users that were currently using the place. So, in summary, and it's important to remember that sportsmen and sportswomen and their licensed dollars have done a lot for the conservation of wildlife in Montana. The wildlife professionals at Fish, Wildlife, and Parks have been instrumental in the recovery and conservation of grizzly bears. But wildlife professionals are no longer running Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. It is a sad day for wildlife management in Montana when a few extreme politicians can damage the foundations of science and fact-based wildlife management at Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. If anti-carnivore legislation and its implementation by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks administrators and the governor-appointed commission continues, we stand to lose much more than healthy carnivore populations. The intrusion of politics into wildlife management threatens the very foundation of scientific wildlife management in Montana and the acceptance of hunting as a legitimate, non-political management tool. And on top of this political problem, we face unrelenting increases in the number of people who want to live in Montana and recreate in wildlife habitat. Instead of being regulated, this increase in land development and recreation is being actively promoted by state and federal agencies as an economic benefit to communities and businesses without any consideration of the intensifying negative impacts of this development and recreation on the resident wildlife and the recreation user experience. The very reasons people live here are going to disappear if this continues, and we need to recognize that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Mike Bader, do you want to go next?
Sure.
Thank you.
I think this is going to work for us. Thanks for coming out tonight. Thanks for asking me to be here. I love to talk about wildlife. Usually talk about grizzly bears, but not so much tonight. So what is the fate of Montana wildlife? We'll try and answer that, but I think the real answer is it's up to all of us. And wildlife management in Montana has come a long way since about 100 years ago, when most large ungulates were reduced to a handful here and there. Wolves were essentially extirpated. Other predators and species like the grizzly existed only in national parks and parts of bordering wilderness. But conservation efforts helped turn this around. The Sun River Game Preserve was established. Elk habitat areas on the Gallatin Forest. Herds rebounded, wolves returned, grizzly bears increased their numbers and distribution. Predator-prey balance is being restored to our ecosystems. And yes, lawsuits have helped. It's been a big part of it. But it's all at risk of being undone. What I call the forces of the past who are irrationally anti-predator, they've got control now. The governor's office, the legislature, the Fish and Wildlife Commission. And I think they're largely hiding behind the North American model of wildlife conservation and passing regulations and laws that are unethical, they're unsporting, they're not fair chase. And so these authoritarian hardliners have really tarnished a really good reputation that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks had as probably the leading fish and wildlife management agency in the United States. The Game Warden Division is being depleted by retirements and transfers. Biologists, managers are driven underground. There's a state of fear and intimidation, and everybody's looking over their shoulders. You know, and for decades, I could call Fish, Wildlife, and Parks biologists and managers and request information which was readily shared. Now everything requires a public records request form. Then you have to wait 4 weeks for the information, and then you get charged a fee for public information. So what's wrong there? I think we know. Agency biologists tend to stick to their field work and not really rock the boat. But once career biologists retired, they were free to speak. And they began to speak out in public about the deep concerns they have about the direction that wildlife management is taking in Montana. And to kind of go back almost 100 years, you've all heard of Aldo Leopold. And some of these terms are a little outdated because it was almost 100 years ago. But he wrote, "The public, not the sportsman, owns the game. The public is, and the sportsman ought to be, just as much interested in conserving non-game species, forests, fish, and other wildlife as in conserving game. In the long run, lopsided programs dealing with game only, songbirds only, forests only, or fish only will fail because they cost too much, use up too much energy and friction, and lack sufficient volume of support. Yet our legislature and Fish and Wildlife Commission are on a lopsided approach, a single track. Let's get rid of predators. They're bad. Let's reduce them. They're hurting things. And it's all based on pretty bad facts. So what we really need is an ecosystem approach. When you think about it, when the big things fail, the small things suffer. When the small things fail, the big things suffer. And either way, it's the landscape that suffers and the people who enjoy those landscapes and are sustained by them. So if you think of what we've got here, we've got 98% of the species that were here when Lewis and Clark came through. Not in great numbers, some of them just barely alive, but they're here. So the wolf, the grizzly, the mountain lion, and other carnivores are holding these landscapes together. The extreme laws and regulations in Montana are based on unscientific information, do not represent fair chase or proper wildlife management. Without the predator-prey relationship, these wildland ecosystems will become glorified zoos. So we need to do something. We need to determine the fate of Montana wildlife. That means voting, it means writing letters to the editor, it means coming to meetings like these, it means sending $25 to a nonprofit group, especially ones that sue the government, because that happens to be the only branch of government left that we have access to, seriously. You don't have access to Congress. You don't have access to the governor. You do have access to the courts. So that's something that we need to work on. When there's comment periods, comment on those. So we all have to pull together. We got to get rid of the governor that's in there, because until we do, this is the way it's going to be, and it's not going to be good, and the fate of wildlife will be bad. So thanks for coming out, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Mike. Some of you might think Dave is a photographer. He's actually a panelist. So next up is Dave Stalling.
Thank you. Is that working? Hey, it's quite an honor to be on this panel with some of these speakers. I appreciate it. When I told my brother Ed, who's a drummer here in town, some of you might know, and I told him I was going to be on this panel tonight and mentioned the other speakers, and he said, "How the hell did you get on that panel?" And it's a good question. I don't know. I'm a hunter and an angler, and here to offer that perspective. And I strongly believe that our current system of wildlife management really needs some reform. And I want to start by telling this little story of something happened to me a few months ago. It was a cold day in January, one of those real cold days, and I was out on Georgetown Lake ice fishing, something I love to do. And as a lot of you probably know, Georgetown Lake is an artificially created lake from a dam, and it's full of non-native trout that's managed as a trophy fisheries. You can catch some pretty big rainbow trout out of there. And there's also big brook trout, which aren't native to Montana. They're native to the East Coast, but they manage it as a trophy fisheries. In fact, there's regulations. You're only allowed to keep 5 trout. Only one of them can be a brook trout. It's got to be 16 inches or bigger. And I'm sitting there catching these non-native fish, which are, it's fun to catch them. It's fun to bring them home and eat them. And in the meantime, I'm looking south from Georgetown Lake up into the Anaconda-Pintler Wilderness, where I have spent much of my life hunting elk and mule deer and fishing and backpacking and snowshoeing and going out in the winter and building snow caves and thinking about the wild country up there that makes Montana so special. And last time I was up there was last September, late September, and one night I was sleeping out under the stars and I could hear a lot of elk bugling, and in the distance I heard wolves howling. So while I'm catching all these non-native trophy fish in an artificial lake, back in January, I'm thinking, oh, there's a whole bunch of Montanans out there in the wilderness killing our native wolves. They can kill up to 20. They can kill 10 trapping, 10 shooting. As Chris mentioned, they can snare them and trap them and shoot them. They can shoot them at night on private lands. It's just ridiculous. So why are we slaughtering our native predators while we're managing for these big non-native trophy fish? And that is our system of wildlife management summed up right there. It's designed to provide opportunities for hunters and anglers, sometimes to the detriment of our native wildlife. And why is that so? So I wanted to talk about some of the myths. And in addition to that, we're killing prairie dogs just for fun. They're having predator killing contests. Non-native pheasants are put out all over the place, so there's opportunities to shoot, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet we're treating our native predators with absolutely no respect or dignity. And grizzlies are next, as several people have mentioned. And the myths and the lies and the misconceptions about grizzlies are already flying around. Wolves are not managed by science. They are managed by politics, driven by myths, lies, and misconceptions. You've probably heard a lot of them. Hunters love to spout these. They're not the wolves that were native here. They're a vicious, diabolical Canadian wolf that are just killers. They're annihilating all our elk. A former director of the Elk Foundation once said that wolves were the worst ecological disaster since the decimation of bison. And now you're hearing the same stories about grizzlies. There's too many. We need to kill them. They'll be more respectful of us. Never mind us being respectful to them. That's the way it should be. So I want to talk a little bit, how did this come about? And real quickly, it's based on a couple other big myths. First, that hunters pay for conservation. We don't, and I'm going to talk about that. The other is the North American model of wildlife conservation, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. First, on the hunter's pay. As a lot of you may know, most state wildlife agencies are largely funded by license fees from hunting and fishing licenses, and then also excise taxes, the Pittman-Robertson funds on rifles and bullets, and the Dingell-Johnson funds from gas from motorboats and some fishing equipment. Goes into a big federal fund, and a lot of that is allotted to the state wildlife agencies. So between the license fees and the excise taxes, on average throughout the United States, that funds about 53% of the state wildlife agencies' budgets. In Montana, I believe it's a little higher. I think it's closer to 60%. So that's where this myth comes from, that hunters fund conservation. And because of that, the state and as Gary talked about, the commissioners appointed by the governors, who are also usually hunters and agricultural interests, the state wildlife agencies are basically run and controlled by hunters. There's a couple of problems with that. One, not all the people who buy guns are hunters. I think about 40% of the people who buy guns are not hunters. And something like 2/3 of the people who buy motorboat gas aren't anglers. So it's not necessarily hunters and anglers funding all that. Secondly, not everything they do is conservation. A lot of that money goes towards eradicating predators, killing prairie dogs, introducing non-native species so we can catch them and fish for them, shooting ranges, recruiting more hunters, all that kind of thing. And then secondly, it's not just state agencies that manage our wildlife. There's been studies done out of Nevada's for Responsible Wildlife Management, that looked at funding. When the funding and the money that goes into our federal land management agencies, the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and other agencies and landowners that manage a lot of our public lands and wildlife, which comes from general taxpayers' money, the total contribution from hunters, from we hunters that claim to fund wildlife management, is 6%. We pay about 6% of the conservation of wildlife in this country, and yet we have most of the control. And therefore we can say things like, hey, the wolves are killing all our elk, get rid of them, and that's what they do, and that's what they're doing. And again, grizzlies are next, which has really upset me. Another thing I want to talk about real quick before I run out of time, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the North American model of wildlife conservation. Now, to hear most hunters tell it, you would think that this model was something discovered by Theodore Roosevelt himself on the Mount, engraved in tablets. I mean, literally, it's promoted with religious-like fervor from hunters. You can't have a conversation or a debate with a hunter nowadays without them saying, but the North American model of wildlife conservation, like it's the Bible, and then everybody hushes, like, I mean, I'm exaggerating only a little bit. It's pretty ridiculous. I never heard of it before around the late 1990s, early 2000. That's because the concept didn't exist. Canadian biologist Valerius Geist, Shane Mahoney, and a guy with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service named John Ogren sat down in the late 1900s, and they wrote down a list of 7 principles that they thought helped make wildlife conservation successful in North America. And they called it the North American model of wildlife conservation. As John Ogren himself says, it wasn't meant to be prescriptive. It's not the Bible, it's guidelines of things that were successful. We don't even adhere to it. Most of the principles aren't adhered to. We slaughter wolves, we hold predator killing contests, we introduce non-native species. None of that fits with principles. There's 7 principles of the model. I won't get them to them all now, but you can look them up. But some of the main ones are that wildlife is a public trust, belongs to all of us, that management be based on science, that there be legitimate purposes for killing. So, does going out and shooting prairie dogs fit all that just for fun? Does slaughtering our wolves fit into that? Does wanting to delist grizzlies and go after them fit into all that? I don't think it does. So my efforts lately as a hunter have been focused with groups like Wildlife for All, and I've recently kind of launched my own group called Hunters and Anglers for Wildlife Management Reform, because I'm tired of often hearing this debate portrayed as hunters versus environmentalists, or, you know, hunters hate wolves and other people love them. No, there's plenty of us hunters who actually want to see reform and love wolves and love grizzly bears and love wilderness. I am one of them, and there's lots of others out there, and I'm hoping to kind of unite some of those folks to start speaking out for the need for reform. And just recently I was asked, what does wildlife reform look like? Well, it basically allows all citizens to have a say in protecting all wildlife, including our large carnivores and our predators. I also like to tell people that a really good start in wildlife reform would be to actually adhere to the North American model of wildlife conservation, because we don't. And by the way, I want to put in a quick plug. Anya Heister wrote a remarkable book looking at the history and details of the North American model called Beyond the North American Model. And Anya's an anti-hunter and I'm a hunter, but we get along, and that's what we need. We need a lot more of that. We need to all get together and realize this wildlife belongs to all of us. We all should have a say, and all wildlife needs protected. So, wow, I made it. Thank you.
Last but not least, that was a perfect segue to Rocky Sainert.
Well, thank you so much for allowing me to be on this panel with these people. Got all these degrees and whatnot. Mine has been a hodgepodge education, and I certainly wasn't on any government panel or appointed, worked as a wildlife biologist or anything. But what was just said about how to work together, how can we, because wildlife being a public trust, how can we take that concept and explode it to actually make that a reality? I think that offers a solution to all the problems that have been described by all these good people who have been working so long to try to protect wildlife and finding all these flaws in the wildlife management systems. What I see is that this is a battle of values, the values that we all hold in different ways for this wildlife. And up to now, we've had no way of trying to bring those out into the decision-making process. Now, I wrote 6 pages I was going to speak, and then I submitted this to ChatGPT AI, and I got 1.5. And so it's a very valuable tool and an honest one, too. I think as long as you write the first draft and you check it and make sure what it said. And so I think because of all that effort, to show a potential solution to all these problems that have been laid out, I just want to go ahead and read what was written. So I think we can agree that Montana's wildlife management system is failing, and it's plagued by political and commercial biases that overlook the broader benefits and values and protection for all species and focuses instead on just a select few. This approach neglects the values held by non-consumptive users, such as biodiversity, ecological services, and intrinsic wildlife values. We need a new paradigm, a public wildlife trust that ensures equitable, humane, and conservation-focused management. So what do we mean when we say wildlife? Well, wildlife, along with its habitat, forms a vital part of our global environmental commons. That it's not just the wildlife that belongs to all of us, it's the whole life support system that we call the environment. So recognizing wildlife as common property rather than private or public property reflects our collective interest in preserving biological diversity and environmental health. But in using that word property, we sort of open up a Pandora's box. But because the solutions to getting these values into the public decision-making process turn on the legal concepts that property allows, but you have to have the legal terminology of property in order for there to be a public trust, because a trust involves beneficiaries, someone to serve as a trustee, and property that's transferred to the trustee to benefit the beneficiaries and produce the benefits that these people desire. And that's, everyone here has a little bit different idea about what should be produced and the benefits that we should enjoy from the management of the wildlife. And this, I think, just the fact of recognizing the communal ownership that preceded handing off that ownership to the government to manage these important assets and valuable resources is a step in the right direction, because it fights this meism and weism dichotomy that we seem to have in this country. So a trust, as I said, involves transfer of ownership to a trustee for asset management and protection. In the context of wildlife, a public trust arises when citizens entrust the government with their environmental property, if you will, retaining equitable rights so you can hold the government accountable as the beneficiary of a trust. This is what any beneficiary of any trust can do. This is not new law. This has incredibly deep roots in the English legal system and probably way back beyond that to the Institutes of Justinian. Montana's Constitution, emphasizing a clean and healthful environment, implicitly supports this trust by mandating state protection of wildlife and habitats. But the current legislative approach in Montana fails to protect the wide range of interests of all citizens in all wildlife, favoring specific groups and economic interests. This failure breaches the state's fiduciary duties as trustee of public wildlife assets. And these fiduciary duties are ethical principles that any trustee has to follow and that any beneficiary can invoke to challenge the decisions that any trustee makes. And so my little organization, which is me and two other people on the board, I call it Nature Rising, with a fist in the air, I guess, intends to challenge the state's wildlife management through a comprehensive lawsuit based on public trust principles. And this aims to overhaul the existing system, advocating for a new management model that aligns with democratic values, equitable rights, and fiduciary responsibilities. Now, the design of this new system is intended to be shaped through negotiations. And the way we get to that spot is to invoke the concept of non-judicial environmental dispute resolution, which is a series of 3 courses you can take at the university, and law students also take these negotiable techniques in solving problems outside of the judicial process, but can be mandated if you can get the judge to say, okay, I'm not going to decide these values. I'm going to let you guys sit down. It's very familiar in labor and divorce situations, and it's been popularized too in many environmental disputes, but usually some legislator comes riding in and blows everything up. Well, that's what I want to avoid. I would like to make it so that besides enjoining so many of these decisions, laws, and rules that the state has made through the commission, that various agencies, not just wildlife and parks, there's transportation, there's agriculture, a lot of agencies violate the terms of fiduciary duty. But the last, and so I would like to see injunctions against individual laws and rules and regulations. But in the end, I'd like to see some sort of a new institution, call it the Congress of Wildlife Beneficiaries, that is negotiated and established where ordinary citizens representing the various values and viewpoints that people hold in wildlife can volunteer and be picked by lottery to sit on this council. And they will decide the terms of the trust. And the state will agree to, once those terms are decided and communicated to them, that the legislature will enact them into law. Now, one of the key issues is if the legislature is the primary trustee, it's highly unusual that a trustee can set the terms of the trust. So that kind of leaves them out of the picture until they agree that they're going to do what this Congress of Wildlife Beneficiaries, which is all of us, has said that they would like to see done. And so at that point, the state becomes the servant of the people again. And through democratic process, we can take back this power that has produced all of these horror stories you've just heard about from all 7 people. And that's, I'm looking for a good pro bono attorney who knows the ins and outs of government reform and can talk about trusts to a judge, and some deep pockets newcomer that would like to get in on the fun. I myself have received my little, some funding from a family trust over in Bozeman to support this work. And so I won't have to do odd jobs anymore to supplement my Social Security. And there's a lot of precedent for this kind of thinking, this paradigm change that's been, lots of resources are available, and I'd like to make them available in some way, but I'm still working on that. I call myself an independent scholar and researcher because I don't have any other credential to justify sitting up here and telling you these things. So I think that's really the gist of my message. I think I've got a solution here that could empower people to take back their rights that we have lost when the government decides that it knows better than we do about how to manage our common resources. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rocky. I almost felt a little provoked there when you were talking about lawmakers and a Congress. But I also want to wish you good luck with that. Did you have a comment?
I wanted to clarify one thing you said. I think you gave me way too much credit if you said my research was tantamount to our Children's Trust lawsuit. That honor belongs to Mary Christina Wood, a professor at the University of Oregon Law School, who wrote this amazing book called Nature's Trust. I highly recommend it. It's in paperback. It's written not for lawyers, but for ordinary people, and you can get it on the internet.
Okay, well, you better talk to some folks on the interwebs about that.
What's it called?
I pulled all a lot of your bio off the web, so thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, well, I couldn't
that's really
take credit
important. Just a little more housekeeping. We've been sitting here for a while. I just want to point out that there's some water at the back of the room. Remember, the restrooms are down the hall. But I also want to start question and answer. So you can ask a question of any one of the panelists that you want. Try to keep it to the topics that they spoke on. This gentleman right here.
I appreciate your diverse perspectives on this, but it seems like almost all of you have talked about pursuing political avenues to try to, address this issue. But what I don't understand, I see our current extremist state legislature and essentially a captive, misinformed electorate gives us a situation where I hope that the political process, the democratic process can still, bring about some change, positive change. But if it doesn't, do any of you have any other plans for action? One of the things I don't understand, why don't people ever consider something like targeted economic boycotts supported by sophisticated media campaigns as a way of using economic power when the political process is increasingly becoming degraded and corrupted?
Did you want to put that in a specific question to one of the panelists?
Well, I just throw it out to everyone, who I'm all for pursuing political avenues. You guys have a lot of experience dealing with, the legislature and then the judiciary and the executive and other bureaucratic offices. But what hope do you really think there is in the pursuing political solutions at this point? And if not, shouldn't we pursue things like economic boycotts and actions and media campaigns to support those? And specifically, I'm thinking of one of the best ways to get people behind economic boycotts is to really make them aware of, the reality on the ground, of what's happening. There's a lot of sophisticated technology and high quality optics and things like that that can show people what is being done out there in the wilderness that they maybe have some idea of, but I think a lot of us don't even like to really face what's happening.
Does anybody want to fill out?
I think you do both. I think we have to operate at the legislative level, as everybody's talking about. It's like the multiple truths thing I mentioned earlier. And I think what Dave said about getting along, he's a hunter, and the person you referenced is not, and your friends. And you have to fight the battle on multiple fronts. But it's ultimately, I think, for real change, grassroots, and not vilifying people because they're from somewhere else. And one of the things that I do in my role as poet laureate is do a lot of workshops and things. And my feeling is that you get someone who has no experience with wilderness or the outdoors or whatever. You put their ass in a canoe or a raft, or you go hunting with them or whatever, and let the change that the world brings to all of us take root in them. And I think all these folks aren't going anywhere. So. And of those 300 and whatever thousand new ones, which was a shocking number, they're not all people that we can't bring to our understanding of how the world works and what we need to do to make things better. So I think we have to do all of it. So the answer is yes to every question. Yeah, we have to fight at the legislative level, because if we give up, we've already lost, but we also have to gather like we are here. And I used to sell a sticker at an artist, draw a picture of a monkey wrench, and I said, when all else fails, and that was the sticker to harken back to many of our literary initiation into environmentalism. But yeah, that's my take on it. I'm sorry, I just hate dead air.
Okay, it's their hand.
I guess I'd try and just add to that a little bit by saying I'm a firm believer that elections have consequences, no matter what. And so I think that one of the first things we need to do is just really focus on electing or supporting and electing those candidates that share our values, whether those values be wildlife or environmental protection or health care or education. Elections have consequences. Make sure you pay attention to who's running for these various positions, and that's how you ultimately affect change. And the pendulum swings back and forth, right and left, from far right to far left. And the idea is get people in there who share your values and support those people. And the commission system that we have really does work well when you've got good people who approach it in the right manner. It can be corrupted if you have a legislature that is trying to basically prescriptively legislate every single aspect of wildlife management. But if they approach it the way they should, the system we've got can work pretty darn well. You just have to have the right people in there. That's my thoughts.
I on here then, so questions for just a second.
My name is Bob Carter. And in the interest of full disclosure, I am a legislator in the session right now. To Chris Lattre's comment, I am not on the governor's Christmas list. I am in the supermajority, or in super minority rather. We have a majority against Democrats right now. And the comments about legislators and how important it is critical. In fact, we've got 8 legislators in the Missoula area that think a lot like the people who are on our panel tonight, but we have, believe it or not, 3 of the 5 legislators down the Bitterroot are super moderate legislators that got together with the Democrats, and we defeated 19 constitutional amendments this last session. One of the constitutional amendments was to, they deserve a minute of applause because they are now being targeted by people who do not agree with people who are moderate. But one of the constitutional amendments was to make trapping part of the Constitution as a means of taking games here. And so to Gary's questions or comments, my question is, was the statute for having cyanide bombs ever corrected?
No. In fact, that was specific to the fact that FWP does not have management authority for coyotes. It reflects also on a lot of the potential trapping regulations. FWP can implement regulations for fur bearer trapping, but not for coyote trapping. Management of coyotes is relegated to the Department of Agriculture.
We have a question from a young woman over here.
Okay, my name is Marian, and I moved here from Austria 3 years ago with my family. I'm a teacher in public school here. And when I first came here, I was like overwhelmed and very naive, thinking, oh, this is so beautiful, all this wilderness, all you have here, it's incredible. And then I woke up, kind of. First, I heard about that trapping, which for me was like incredible, because like in Europe, that's banned for like 100 years. I couldn't even believe that was still allowed. And then, yeah, of course, shooting of wolves, grizzly bears, all that, but because of the coyotes, that's what I wanted to comment. What really made me wake up was a comment one of my students said a week ago. So he told me, well, I prefer snowmobiling to skiing because that's how I can run over the coyotes and kill them. And I was like, what? Like, I couldn't believe what he was saying. And then he said, oh yeah, because they don't feel any pain anyway, so that's all right. And I was like, what? You know, and I tried to talk to him. I tried to talk to his mom, and that's where I saw where his attitude was coming from. But now I think I also talked to my principal because, you know, I want to change things in school because I think these are the young people. That's where we can make a change, and that's where we should do something. But he was like, oh, no, this is such a hot topic. I don't want to have anything to do with it. But I still think that's where we should start. And if you say the laws are failing, then at least like everybody should have the conscience by themselves to not do those cruel things, you know? And I think school is a very good way to start. So what I would like to know is what can I do and how can I be supported in that? Because there I feel kind of alone, you know? And yeah, what can be done to get more information out? Because I feel a lot of people do not know that 16-year-olds run over coyotes, you know? And I called Fish and Wildlife, by the way, and got the same information. Oh yeah, coyotes are not game. You can do with them whatever you want, you know? So yeah, I think that would be important. How can we get more information out to young people? Because that will be the next generation. That will be the generation that decides.
Well, as a teacher, you better
Thank you.
fast before the legislator puts a muzzle on you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think one thing is, you know, seek opportunities to make presentations at schools, you know, get to know teachers. It is kind of tough because, like your principal said, it's very hot and they're afraid of that. And, you know, I used to do educational programs on bull trout, and some schools, it was too hot for them, even to save fish or water. So it's not easy, but if you can, you know, get into some education networks, and maybe look at some of the existing groups like Watershed Education Network or the Clark Fork Watershed Protection Program out of Montana Tech. They might have ideas of certain teachers that are receptive and willing to do it and might be in a position where they can do it without being punished.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, and to add to that, I would just say that if you haven't been there, go take a look at the Montana Natural History Center here in Missoula. They have a lot of good youth education programs. Now, they're not going to focus on why you shouldn't run over a coyote with a snowmobile. That's not going to be what they're going to lead with. But they're going to lead with programs that will help young people learn and appreciate the value of wildlife, not just deer and elk that you're hunting, but all species of wildlife. So I'd say that would be a good place to connect with if you haven't done so already.
Thanks.
I wanted to add, just the fact that you are learning all you can and you're here is already doing more than a lot of people do, so thank you.
We have a question here.
I wanted to go on with what she said. I'm looking around me, and most of the people here are older. I belong to the Blackfoot Council. Almost all of our members are older. We had an event out on the conservation 5,000 some acres just 2 weekends ago. Everyone was older. It seems to me if we don't get the youth involved in this, we are in trouble, right? And part of the problem is the youth aren't getting out there anymore. I think the hunters have the best way of getting, have gotten youth out, but they also get them out to run over coyotes and kill wolves. I mean, I think we're in real trouble here if we don't get young people involved right away. Now, you talked about the Endangered Species Act passing by both groups, it come together. Well, we all grew up with Walt Disney on Sunday night watching the animals, getting outside and playing. That's not happening now. I live out in Potomac. We have a lot of kids that I never see their faces because they're inside the house playing games and stuff. So I think one of the things we need to do, and I would ask you guys this, all of you, except for this young lady is, has been around, has seen life. How do we get the youth involved? How do we get them out and excited about what's going on? How do we get them, concerned about the land that's being used up and the animals that live on it? I don't know. It seems to me almost really hard. And it seems to me that we have all these meetings and there's never any real young people, I apologize to you people who are young, showing up, and we just keep going and talking, and they're still not here. So that's my question.
It's a big problem that you've identified, but one thing is to try and make it fun. When I did the bull trout stuff, I would do stuff out on the Clark Fork River, and I had this song called the Bull Trout Blues, so I brought my acoustic guitar, and they were religious and listened to what I had to say because they just wanted to get to that guitar part and sing along. But yeah, it's really hard and it's discouraging because I think of it all the time. Like if there were a whole bunch of young people that had come on, I might have, taken partial retirement and, now I'm putting it off because there's no replacement. Not that I'm irreplaceable, but other people aren't replaceable. So I don't really have a good answer other than that we need to figure out what motivates young people and approach them with that language, because if they're not listening to our language, we're just shouting out into the wind. So I don't know how that happens, but maybe through their own peers, developing somebody who really does like the outdoors, and then they tell their friends how much fun they had and that, you should have gone out with me and my uncle or whatever. But those are just a couple of thoughts.
I have some thoughts to add. I recently put together an event at Imagination Brewing, and we did a conservation careers panel. So I connected with the environmental law group at the law school here. And it was mostly people around my age or younger. And I actually had somebody come up to me at the end who was not a member of my generation, but was older and was upset at how young everybody was. I couldn't believe it. I was like, this is amazing. This never happens, because you're right. And we talk about it all the time. And I think what Chris talked about is how to engage young people, because wildlife can be abstract, especially in the world that young people grow up in, which is largely screen-oriented or indoor-oriented, even different than the way I grew up. Teenagers coming up now don't have, I think, the same access to the outdoors or encouragement to go outside that even I did. And what young people are interested in, I think, not to speak for all of them, but from what I know, is social justice and environmental justice. And so, again, going back to what Chris was talking about, it's not just wildlife. It's the houseless people. It's taking care of your neighbor. It's going into these different communities and building relationships and showing people that compassion for each other is a way to show them compassion for wildlife. And I think young people can have a more holistic perspective than just, I love grizzly bears or I love wolves. It's a luxury, or it seems like a luxury until you know more about the biodiversity crisis and how that's going to just, it's on par with the climate crisis. But it's a luxury to care about wildlife. It's a luxury to go into environmental activism, because a lot of people are wondering, what are their kids going to eat? How do you communicate with those people as being a human being first and foremost, and leading with that instead of wildlife? So, and I think there's many ways we can communicate. Yeah.
Thanks, Lizzie.
I have faith in young people. And when I think about what I was into when I was 20 versus what I am now, Muhammad Ali said, if I was the same person at 50 that I was at 20, what have I done for the last 30 years? And I have literally spoken to thousands of young people over the last 6 months, traveling around doing my poet laureate stuff, from second graders to high school to college. And I think there's a lot more energy out there than maybe we see. A lot of students right now are studying. Those of us who are older often have more time to come to things like this. But I would say the last, how I've spent my time recently gives me hope. And I'm not known as a hope guy. I mean, my newsletter is called An Irritable Métis. There's a reason for that. But I do. I think we will have them when we need them. We just have to listen to them too, which is another great philosopher, Rocky Balboa, in the first Creed movie said, if you're talking, you're not listening. And we owe that to them as well.
Thanks, Chris. I've got a question back here first. Oh, and I didn't forget you.
Thank you. This question is for Gary and Chris, but in general for everyone. I want to say, where did we go wrong? And the we part is those in professional wildlife management and hunting groups. I particularly think of the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, the great work when they were established, cooperating with the government, the Game and Fish, and some of the large land purchases that were vital, were critical. And now their voice is being, one of the leading anti-wolf organizations. And I can't fault necessarily the organization without looking at professionals and saying somehow we didn't get our message across, or there was some critical point. And Chris, directed to you, you mentioned 3 areas that the myths of hunting grizzly bear, and you say this is untrue, this is untrue, this is untrue, and I think somehow perhaps where did we go wrong? Did we give the wrong message? Did we hit them on a bad day? Because I truly believe that there's still advocates and allies out there for, to regain some of these past groups that were advocates, did great things historically in the last 30, 40 years that shouldn't be counted among enemies or whatever, but somehow where did we go wrong?
Well, a quick thought on that is the organization that you mentioned there, they've been politically co-opted to be part of the political power structure, and that's what's going on there. And they're no longer representing wildlife; they're representing an aspect of a political system that is in power at this time. And in terms of the professionals and the organizations, I have many friends in fish, wildlife, and parks, and professional biologists, and the word that several of them have used to me about the current situation is despair. That's what they feel. They didn't sign up for this, they said. And I didn't sign up to work for this kind of an organization. And they are being threatened by not speaking, told not to speak to anybody and not represent anything different than what the director's office says, which is what the governor's office says. So, yeah, it's a time of great despair in the professionals in the state right now, and that's the truth. That's where we are.
Yeah, and that's just a tremendous contrast to what it was like back in 2013 and 2017, the years that I served on the commission. At that point in time, the director had basically an open door policy where he encouraged his field biologists to have one-on-one conversations with constituents, not necessarily to agree with them, but to have open conversations, discuss the policies, take input. And I know as a commissioner, I was always told by the director, feel free to call any of our field people and get the straight story from them. You don't have to just listen to what we're telling you out of Helena. If there's a proposal coming from northeastern Montana about whitetail hunting and you have a question, you call that biologist and ask him. And that kind of open door policy, that type of philosophy that encourages the communication, with the public no longer exists at the department, unfortunately. And as Chris was saying, it's sort of a result of populist politics is kind of what's happened.
Thanks, Gary. Dave.
Yeah, I've got a lot to say on this topic, so I'll try to keep it brief. I remember many years ago when I first started working in the hunter conservation profession, which, almost 40 years. In fact, I worked for Gary Wolf for a while at the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and I got to say, a true Leopolian, one of the best people I ever worked for, and it was a very different organization.
You worked with me, not for me, didn't you?
Oh, well, there you go. You kept me in line, Anyways, I remember one time having lunch with a friend of mine who has since passed away named Jim Posowitz. Some of you might have known Jim. He was just a great philosopher, thinker, retired from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, wrote Beyond Fair Chase, The Ethics and Tradition of Hunting. And I remember kind of telling him that I just didn't fit in. I didn't quite fit in with the environmental folks because I was a hunter that killed elk every year, and I didn't quite fit in with the hunters because they hated wolves and grizzlies, and I love them. And Jim kind of smiled and leaned close to me, and he said, you know why, Dave? Because you and I, we're Leopolians, and there aren't many of us around. So ever since then, I've liked to use the word Leopolian, which, of course, is for Aldo Leopold, author of Sand County Almanac and considered the father of modern wildlife management, and a great thinker. And ever since I've been involved in the hunting world, there was always this sort of split in the hunting world between what I simplify by calling the Leopolians and the Safari Club NRA types. And I don't think I need to go further into that. And unfortunately, I have watched the Safari Club NRA type grow and take over the hunting world because they have the money and the power. There's this huge sort of hunting industrial complex, I think, to steal one of Anya's phrases, of this hunting world that's so commercialized. And it includes the media and the hunting shows and the industry. And, even here at the University of Montana now, in the wildlife department, they have a Boone and Crockett Club professor. They have classes that are sponsored by the Boone and Crockett Club, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. I mean, there's this huge hunting industry that controls every aspect of hunting now. The politics, a lot of the wildlife departments. Not that there aren't some great people out there. In fact, Chris Servine, I have tremendous respect and admiration for all the work you've done. But that world is controlled so much by money. And Aldo Leopold himself once said, when talking about hunting organizations, said that they tend to start appealing to the lowest common denominator. That's what I saw happen at the Elk Foundation when I was there. After Gary and other good Leopoldtian like-minded folks left, it was sort of taken over by NRA Safari Club types who hate wolves, hate grizzlies, told people what they wanted to hear, and gained membership from that because they were telling a lot of hunters what they want to hear. Wolves are evil. We need to kill them all and then go after the grizzlies. And they grew. I mean, because that's the way, unfortunately, the world is. And then you have people like Randy Newberg, who runs a hunting show here. And he's on his show telling people that every hunter has an obligation to kill wolves. And if you're not a hunter, you have no business getting involved in wildlife management. Those are the kind of things he's saying on his program. And there's a real McCarthyistic-like attitude. If you're a hunter like me that speaks out against some of these stuff, there are repercussions. I've been banned from writing for magazines. I've been fired from organizations because, it's McCarthyism at its finest, and it's only getting worse. And I could go on, but I'll end with another, and I'm going to have to paraphrase here because I don't have it in front of me. But Aldo Leopold once said something along the lines of fish and game departments are so busy producing things to shoot at that they have forgot the cultural value of what they're doing. And there are no leaders to tell hunters what is wrong. I think there are some leaders. I think Chris and Gary are good leaders, but there's not a lot. And they're often kept quiet. So enough on that. I could go on all night on that topic.
Thanks, Dave. I've got a question here, and then this
I'd
young
like to
woman.
say something on that topic.
Yeah,
Just a second.
Go ahead.
Only because this is a piece of information you can verify for yourself on the internet. There's a National Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus. Look that up and see who's on it. John Tester was co-chair of that organization, and it's not wildlife friendly. It's hunting and fishing friendly. There's also a Montana Legislative Sportsmen's Caucus. And legislators from right here in Missoula have been on that too. So if you don't know why something's happening with some of this, it's because that's a powerful organization, especially the national one, that has a foundation that supports its and promotes its legislation. So I just thought you might want to be aware of that.
That was important. Thank you, Rob.
Paul Fiedler. He claims to be a wildlife biologist, and I have not been able to find out where he was a wildlife biologist or what his background is. As far as I know, his official degrees are not in that field. So I would like to know if any of you know anything about him.
I do.
Oh, good.
I do.
Good.
I think he's got a degree.
He uses that as cred. He uses that as cred to do his thing.
He's got a degree from Morgan State University on the East Coast, and he worked for the organization that manages the lakes that were created by damming the Columbia over on the eastern side of the Cascades, and those mountains there around, can't remember the name of the town. I think his main job was pulling muskrats out of culverts to keep the water flow.
Yeah, he worked for a public utility district.
Water
That's
utility,
what it's called.
yeah.
And Chelan County, and he's not a wildlife biologist. He's a politician.
Seems to be a trend. I've got a question here.
Hi. So this started out as a question, but turned into more of a comment, I think, since a lot of the questions that I had were answered. But I am a wildlife ecologist and science communicator working in aquatic invasives, which seems a lot more peaceful than what you guys are dealing with. Didn't think it would be, but here we are. On the topic of how to involve youth, I think that part of it is, at least in my experience with my current job is that oftentimes youth are hired or given internships, if they are hired at all, and then left at a very low level. And at first, you know, they're given a lot of opportunities or told that they're going to have a lot of opportunities to reach out to their peers and get other young people involved. And then once those ideas come to fruition, they are dropped. And I think that that's part of the problem, is that there's very little youth in leadership. And that goes back to that intersectionality that Lizzie and Chris were talking about. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for nonprofits, specifically in Montana, where we see very little intersectionality in a lot of the state agencies, to jump on that. And not to, I think that there's a lot of the outdoor education focus, but I also see that state agencies are given priority over nonprofits when it comes to that. I think that a lot of schools go directly to the state when it comes to education. And the curriculum at the state level is very much hook and bullet focused. And so one of the pathways forward would be to think about, where are the kids looking? If they're looking at their screens, why aren't we taking more of a social media presence? Especially if TikTok is banned with the state, that's a venue. I mean, you can be hopping on these places that many of the state biologists who are, you know, feeling despair and hopelessness, they wish that they could be on those venues. This is an opportunity, I think, for a lot of nonprofits to do that.
I want to add, I'm glad you brought that up again. First of all, I want to say we got a TikTok contractor, because so many of us are like, this seems like a good idea, but none of us know how to use it. And I wanted to say this earlier, mentorship is so important. Every single person up here should be mentoring 5 people. If you're passionate and you know things, find young people who are similarly passionate and teach them and pay them. So many, when I was coming up, it was like, oh, you want to work in wildlife? Hope you can afford to do that for 40 hours a week for free. Like, that is not tenable. I make a good salary and I can barely afford to live in Missoula, and many people can't. So I wanted to get on my high horse there and say, find people, mentor them, and support them so that when they do have good ideas and they do take initiative, they can keep going through the years.
I would just quickly add, too, to just show them success stories, like the Held versus Montana case is awesome. And it shows how youth can take on the big bad boys and kick their ass. And so people like to, you know, see inspirational people. You know, it's like basketball stars, you know, people look up to them. Sometimes they don't get the lesson that they would want, but having people believe that they can change things. Because I think when we go back to that word despair means you've given up hope. You can't change anything. You're trapped in the system. And so I would think that young people feel kind of trapped with climate change. And, you know, I've been chewed out before by young people. Like, you know, people in your generation really blew it. And what do you say? You know, even if you've spent your whole life, you know, working for good things, it's true. And so I think that there's ways to inspire them to show that you can change the world. You really can. And, you know, and it's been done. So when people have hope, that's the opposite of despair. Then you've got freedom. And when you've got freedom of thought and speech, you know, you can start bringing people together around ideas. And so I'm hoping the young people will lead us to the promised land, and we'll say thank you very much.
I just wanted to thank everybody for their perspectives on this panel tonight, and I wanted to offer my perspective. I'm a Bitterroot Salish mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and part of our original instructions were to speak for those who can't. And I think this is very, very appropriate in this case. The grizzlies, the wolves, all those relatives. And I think part of the issue here is just that indigenous perspective. It's a different paradigm. We look at those as our relatives, not to be owned, not to be managed. So here we are today, 2024, and this is where we are. So my family is a subsistence, lived a subsistence lifestyle. So if we fished, we gave offering. If we took a animal's life for our food, and that's the only reason we take an animal's life is for our food, then we do an offering. Same with our plant foods and our plant medicines, all of that. So my tribe, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe, we're the first tribe to establish wilderness. The Mission Mountain Wilderness is 100,000 acres. We close off part of that every July for grizzly bears so they can come down and eat whatever bugs they eat in the McDonald Lake area. That's I guess if you want to call it a sacrifice that we do for people that want to recreate there. We do that for our relatives, the grizzly bears, so that they can live and so that they can prosper. We also do fishing derby where to remove the mac, the lake trout from Flathead Lake. My done a lot of good things. I'm one person that fought my council colleagues when I was on council when they wanted to put a casino near the animal bridge, because we fought long and hard for that animal bridge and all those wildlife crossings. I lost that battle, but I saw it as a transportation connectivity between those three ecosystems, the Selway, Bitterroot, the Yellowstone, and the northern ecosystem for the bears. When you're talking about the youth, with youth and a lot of my previous jobs, our tribe has a lot of good people that you could invite to your classroom that are very wildlife, environmentally oriented, so I'll connect with you afterwards. And that's who we need to focus on, because their parents, some of their parents, they're a lost generation. We shouldn't even bother with them. I'm aspiring to take this battle and others into the Montana legislature, not because I enjoy politics, but because I feel like my voice needs to be heard and I can be a voice for those relatives that can't speak. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shelley. We are over time, folks, but I don't want to stop the conversation. We're not getting kicked out yet. We're going to field one more question and allow the panelists brief closing comments. And then Savannah's going to come up and wrap us up.
Hello, my name is Colleen Hines, and I'm also running for legislature in the infamous Clark Fork Valley of Thompson Falls and Paul Fielder's country. So I just, well, thank you, but it's not for accolades. But I just want to say, when you were saying, watching the tide turn, after reading Ryan Bussey's book, Gunfight, and all the recent expose of the NRA and all their corruption, I would think that the NRA would be like on a slippery slope and not getting all their stuff they want. I don't know, but I'm hoping that that would give them a turn down. But do you guys see it that way? That's all. That's my question.
I mean, they are in trouble. Their executive directors in some hot water about money. Big surprise. Money causing a problem.
Yeah, there's an organization that operates a lot more behind the scenes than the NRA. It's called the National Shooting Sports Foundation. They're the sponsors of the annual SHOT Show, which is the shooting, hunting, and outdoor trade show. They're primarily funded by the firearms and sporting industry, and they are very, very effective at legislation. So even if the NRA loses a little bit of clout by, say, the National Shooting Sports Foundation has a lot of behind-the-scenes clout. They're just not as much out in front to the public as the NRA is.
Anybody else?
Just gonna say,
A quick question.
Rocky, we don't own the animals. And speaking, Dave, to the North American model, we can't consider them a resource either. They're not a resource. We can't own them. They're in our trust, and then something you said about occupations that young people can get into, like one of the #1 occupations coming up is restoration ecology, billions of dollars in that. So, what do you think about wildlife ownership? We don't own it. We have to speak for them, but we can't. They're not really a trust because we don't own them. They're part of the land.
Well, I would say that the whole legal system is a fiction that we use to manage conflict between people in regard to material things. So I kind of figured there would be people who would object to that concept that wildlife can be property. But property is also defined as a series of interests that you have in a particular thing, whether it's a piece of land, your car, your notebook, your pen. And so from that perspective, property doesn't mean that you have any private rights in anything or that the government should have rights, but we do have interests that we can defend when we're looking at something like wildlife, because our values are important to us and they're not all the same. The non-consumptive value argument that there's other ways to appreciate wildlife, aesthetically, spiritually, ecological services. And of course you can say, well, that's anthropocentric. Well, that's the kind of a system that we can use, turn it back on itself, using this concept of a trust to make the legislature the trustee and therefore beholden to the citizens as beneficiaries. Now, it is a little ugly to think, we own all those animals out there, but it is sort of a legal fiction that we can use to our advantage. I appreciate your concept and your criticism, but and it's something
Okay.
No, that's a good point.
They have their own intrinsic value, just like the mountains do.
They have a right to exist whether we exist or not, and they'll be here long after we're gone. So the way I look at it.
One final question.
Thanks. I'll keep this really short. Listening to everyone and hearing the questions and hearing the problems, I think we all kind of know that people in the government are heavily influenced by large industry. Large industry, publicly traded companies right now are doing everything they can possibly do to greenwash their image. We're socially right, we're environmentally correct. We get all our energy from solar, whatever their pitch is. I think one way to approach this is to try and reach out more to our captains of industry and call them out on this greenwashing nonsense that they're doing. There's a lot of programs on CNBC that are very interactive. Calls, they take emails, tweets, whatever. They have all kinds of CEOs and board members and Warren Buffett and people like that. I think we need to redirect some of this to people who really do have power and perhaps more will to change it than the government will, because companies are going to do what's going to make the most money for them and what's going to sell for them. So if their consumers are telling them, you know, we don't like the coyote fur on your jackets, and get it public, perhaps that's just another venue, another.
Anybody want to address that? I'm going to take a quick liberty and allow you guys to wrap up, but a couple of topics that weren't covered were this push to allow people who are not members of tribes to hunt on. So there's legislation, there's a lot of talk right now about people who live on reservation land, people who don't live on reservation land, who think that they should be allowed to hunt on reservation land, and they think that they can pass a bill and that they can make that happen. So if anybody wants to touch on that, I'd also be interested to hear if anybody wants to say something about how the ag industry always seems to be the excuse, that attacks on livestock are the go-to. That's the fault when we're talking about predators. I come from rural Montana. I also know how to look up livestock loss board statistics, and I just find it fascinating that this is the argument that comes up over and over and over again. So I'm not trying to tell you what to say, but if you could touch on that, I'd be interested to hear. We can just move from one end of the table to the other.
Make your final selections and take them to the checkout area.
This building closes.
So you're,
I think that we can. Let's go quick.
so the question about the agriculture, what was your relation there? They get all the attention? Is that what you said?
That seems to be the excuse when they're talking about the need to kill predators, manage predator species.
Yeah, wolves kill about, in Montana, about 110 to 120 cattle and sheep a year. And in perspective, in the state of Idaho, there's over 40,000 cattle that are lost every year to poison plants and weather. Just to see that perspective between cattle losses to predators, sheep losses to predators, and everything else. So it is skewed, yeah.
And Jessica, to answer your first question about potential legislation allowing non-tribal members to hunt on tribal land, I think Shelley may be able to address that. She's the former chair of the CSKT, and I'm sure you're very familiar with that proposed legislation.
So the guy that I'm running against, Joe Reed, he proposed in 2023 a bill to allow non-member hunting within the reservation boundaries on fee land. Mostly that affects the Flathead Indian Reservation because of our checkerboard land ownership there. He got spanked in that hearing. Now, a former Fish Wildlife Parks warden, Rick Schoening, pretty sure that's where he was employed. He took it to the Environmental Quality Committee, which is the oversight committee of fish and wildlife.
EQC, Environmental Quality Council. Yeah.
EQC, and they want a ballot initiative this coming up, this session or this election. So the Environmental Quality Council did not pass it. It was 8-8, but they can still bring it forward in a ballot initiative if they get 30,000 signatures from 34 different counties. So that's what I know about it.
More than I knew, so thank you, Shelley.
I'm not running for anything, so I can say not only do I vigorously oppose non-tribal people hunting on tribal land, the only reason there's non-tribal people living on tribal land is because of the Dawes Act, the Allotment Era, and Homesteading Act. And I advocate for all of those people getting spanked right off the reservation. Give it all back. Run the free-range buffalo right down the middle of the Mission Valley again. I'm serious.
Might not be running, but I'm voting for you.
Well, the only thing I would say in concluding tonight is thanks for inviting me here and thanks for showing up, because at least half of life is showing up. And that's, you know, it's tough, and the hearings can be boring or make you upset. But showing up is critical, because if you're not there, you're invisible and you can't be heard. Thanks.
So there were at least 3 wolf hunters who were here tonight, and so it's good they heard us, and they were here. Yep. So, thanks for doing it. It was a good discussion. Appreciate it.
Just want to say thank you.
Related to one of the discussions just a little bit back, I just wanted to say that I think one of the most promising things I've seen recently is summed up in one word: coexistence. And I think the efforts to coexist and better understand these animals. The great writer from here, William Kittredge, once wrote that we need grizzly bears around, if for nothing else, they teach us a little humility. And we need to be humble, and we need to learn to coexist.
I have not much to add, except thank you for having me. It was an honor to get invited to speak on this panel. I think I completely agree with what Chris said, not that it needs me to agree with it, but tribes are sovereign nations, and the little lands that they have left after genocide and land theft for hundreds of years should be completely managed by them. And I think with the livestock issue, we have seen the same misinformation, as Dave was talking about, come out over and over again. And I think we need to stop responding and get out of the box and create a new conversation.
Rocky, did you have a closing comment? Chris?
Well,
were
of
you
course, always going to be promoting the concept of a public wildlife trust, which I think is an incredibly powerful tool that we could use. And the only way we're going to get there is we go to the courts. As someone said in the panel here, that's the only piece of government that we have any influence in. And there's a lot of good environmental legal organizations out there that I'm hoping to interest. In fact, I have an in to the executive director of Wild, the one that that Lizzie works for, but we're failing to make connection. But he's been speaking with the person who gave me my money, and I think maybe that will have some effect. So I'm hopeful.
And my closing comment will be sounding like a broken record. Elections have consequences. Pay attention to what's going on, support good people, and be engaged in the political process, because if you're not, somebody else is going to drive the truck.
Here, here.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, every single one of you speakers, for coming tonight. We really appreciate everything you had to say. And thank you for attending. Yeah, thank you.
Another job.
Wanted to let
Nice to be on panel with you. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate that. Thank you. You guys can see that.